Thank you all for coming this afternoon. Appreciate it on such a beautiful day in the Berkshires. We have an amazing program with amazing people here, authors, performers, and poets, and I'm so glad to be hosting this, and thank Anna for helping so much with doing this. One little bit of housekeeping. If you can, please take a look at the donation basket here. If you can make a donation, terrific. If you can't do it here today, please consider going to reproductiverights.org, and you can make a donation right there. Very important. And you'll understand why if you don't already after today's program. Without further ado, Anna Hogeland is the author of the novel The Long Answer. Her essays have appeared in Lit Hub, Gloss Magazine, iNews, Romper, and elsewhere. She has an MSW from Smith College School for Social Work and an MFA from UC Irvine. She was raised in Williamstown and now lives in Bennington, Vermont, and she's going to get us started off today. So please start by welcoming Anna. Thank you.
Hi, can everyone hear me okay? Okay. Thank you, Richard, and the Bookstore, and these incredible writers that are joining me tonight. It's just an honor to be in your company. It's very, very cool. I'm going to keep some opening remarks very brief because I think we all know why we're here and why this is important. But I just wanted to say briefly that after Roe was overturned, I was just exhausted. I didn't want to accept the reality of it. I didn't want to protest. I didn't want to do any activism. I was just tired and didn't want to engage. And eventually something started to shift, and I became less focused on all of the overwhelming number of things we cannot do, any individual can do in the face of this decision, but also attacks on bodily autonomy and reproductive liberty more generally that are happening constantly. And I started to think about what small actions I might be able to do. And I found that for me, activism works best when it's something that feels really congruent with what brings me joy and connection and hope. And for me, that is this. It's reading with brilliant people who I call my friends in front of you all, and I'm just so glad that this is happening, so thank you. I'm going to read one short poem and then an excerpt from my novel. The poem is by Natalie Handel, and it's called Ways of Rebelling. Who needs to be at peace in the world? It helps to be between wars, to die a few times each day, to understand your father's sky, as you take it apart piece by piece and can't feel anything. Can't feel the tree growing under your feet, the eyes poking night, only to find another night to compare it to. Who ever heard of turning pain into hummingbirds or redbirds? Haven't we grown? What does it mean to be older? Maybe a house without doors can still survive a storm. Maybe I can't find the proper way to rebel, or damn it, I can't leave. I want to, but you grow inside of me. And as I watch you, before I know it, I'm too heavy, too full of you to move. Maybe that's what they meant when they said you shouldn't love a country too much. Okay, in the passage I'm going to read from, the narrator has recently learned that the baby she's carrying, she's pregnant, has a severe heart defect and won't live after he's born. And she's about to be dilated, and she's being interviewed by the resident, and she's very anxious, and her mind is going all sorts of places, and she's wanting to slow down time and speed up time, and she wants to tell all these things to the resident, but there's no room for this kind of conversation in a room like this. So the resident is the one who speaks first. And actually, Shelby, do you mind shutting that door? It's just kind of loud outside. There's some gossip happening outside that I'm like very distracted by. Okay. This is exactly 7 minutes, so you're never too far from the end. And let your mind wander as it will. I've been to enough readings, I understand. Tonight, this is the resident speaking. Tonight, you must shower and wash your body with formula and loofah in this bag, and then wash and shower again tomorrow morning. Do not wash your hair after tonight. That's very important. I nod, aware of my hair, the greasy knot it's made of itself at the nape of my neck. Her hair is clean and slick, blow dried straight. But wait, I want to say before she can move on. Now I want to tell you about something else. The mention of a shower just reminded me of a moment I don't want to forget. It's a moment that may not sound particularly poignant to you or to anyone else. And in fact, I haven't thought about it much since it happened until now. And I'm afraid I'll forget it again if I don't recall it this instant. It took place in Crestline, in the San Bernardino Mountains, where Isaac and I went for the long Thanksgiving weekend. I was about 13 weeks pregnant. The day we drove there had been clear in Irvine and in Riverside, but as soon as we started driving up the mountains, Isaac was driving. A thick fog descended, and we couldn't see more than 10 feet ahead of us until we reached the top of the ridge. From there, all the lights and clutter of LA and the Inland Empire below were totally obfuscated by calm as clouds, giving the illusion of a fjord in the sky. On Thanksgiving Day, we drove the windy roads of the town and around Lake Gregory, looking for any open restaurant, and eventually we found a free community dinner provided by the Rotary Club in a multi-purpose event center on the lake. We ate deep-fried turkey, canned beans, canned corn heavy with salt, gravy, mashed potatoes, and apple pie. My appetite was finally returning at this point. Isaac gave a $30 donation, and we walked around the lake until we got too cold, then went back to the Airbnb, where we watched the Americans and fell asleep early. Even though it was just the two of us, it felt to me like it was our first Thanksgiving as a family. Once we returned to the Airbnb, before we watched the Americans, I decided to take a shower to warm up. The shower was huge, one of the biggest I've ever been in. It could easily have fit 5 or 6 adults. The floor was a mosaic of stones that massaged your feet, and the shower head was detachable, the water pressure incredible. The walls were all clear glass, and if you faced the bedroom, you'd see a full-length mirror so you could watch yourself shower. In fact, it was nearly impossible not to watch yourself shower, and my eye kept catching the moving figure and the reflection by accident, before I decided to look at it with intent. I watched my naked body in the mirror, turning pink for the heat. A few months before, if I'd seen my reflection like this, even though I would have been slimmer all over, I would have turned my back to it. I would have tried to convince myself that the mirror's reflection was warped, and so was my self-image. And it was the two warped perceptions laid over each other that had created an image of my body that offended me, and it was not true to reality. I would have tried to focus instead on the feeling of the hot water on my back and the stones on my feet and the smell of shea butter body wash, and to think of anything other than my body and how it looked and how sick I was of feeling this way toward my reflection, and sick of the guilt that followed, knowing that my body is able, healthy, relatively young, free of chronic pain and discomfort, and even beautiful to some, and most importantly to Isaac. That night in the shower in the Airbnb in Crestline, my breasts were swollen, mammalian. The left breast was a little bigger and lower than the right, in a way I've never noticed before. My thighs were thick and soft, and my stomach was undeniably starting to bulge into a perfectly smooth, round orb, bisected by the slightest hint of linea nigra. I washed each part of my body slowly, moving my hands over my skin, even the crevices between my toes. I don't know if it was because I'd never felt so attuned to my body in pregnancy, or that I had never felt so alien from my body in pregnancy, that enabled me to see it in this way as I never had before. I felt, suddenly and acutely, a heightened appreciation of all the microscopic favors my body had done for me from the moment I'd been conceived until now. Favors descended from generations and generations and generations and generations, the cellular wisdom always imperceptibly improving. Then came the knowledge that I was part of it. My role in our evolution was just as significant as anyone else's. And yet the knowledge of my insignificance in our evolution was also a comfort in a way. Because if I were to die in that instant in the shower, these processes occurring in my body would still be occurring in billions of other bodies. What I mean is, I saw my body as not only my body, but rather as a single reiteration of the female human body. So to call my body ugly and weak, as I have so often called it, would be to call all female human bodies ugly and weak. To call ugly and weak Virginia Woolf and Alice Munro and Adrienne Rich and Frida Kahlo and my mother and Doris Lessing and Emily Dickinson and Toni Morrison and my sister and Mia Farrow and Serena Williams and Sylvia Plath and Sharon Olds and Michelle Obama and Elizabeth Bishop and Elizabeth Taylor and Lady Gaga and June Jordan and Audre Lorde and Mavis Gallant and Joan Didion and how did Judy Garland get in there twice? My eyes. And Sappho and Colette and Elena Ferrante and Beyonce. And I could go on, but I'm sure you get my point. As I tell you this now, I realize I'd thought this cascade of thoughts before, many times. And the moment in the shower of the Airbnb in Crestline was not an epiphany at all, but rather a recurrence of an epiphany that I experienced just infrequently enough that it continues to have an epiphanic effect. For a short time, anyway. Thank you. Our next reader is Alexis Schaitkin, and she's a Williamstown resident. I'm sure you all know her. She's the author of the novels Elsewhere and Saint X, which was a New York Times notable book of 2020. I've read both of these novels, and they're excellent, and I highly recommend them. She lives in Williamstown with her family. Please welcome Alexis.
Hi, everyone. I'm so excited to be here, and thank you again to Anna for organizing this and bringing us all together. It's an issue that's very personal to me, and I'm sure to everybody here. I hope we're not going to overwhelm you with stories that are incredibly on theme, but I'm going to be reading a little bit from Elsewhere. My reading is also exactly 7 minutes. This is a speculative novel about a tiny, isolated village where periodically, once a woman becomes a mother, she is vulnerable to what the townspeople call the affliction, which is that every once in a while, the town will wake up in the morning and a mother will have just vanished, disappeared into the air. And the narrator is a woman named Vera living in the town whose own mother vanished when she was a really little girl. And she is now pregnant and anticipating motherhood and kind of thinking about what sort of mother she will be. I tried to accept my friend Marie's verdict that I was lucky, that my body, which seemed to know just what to do and to be so at ease in pregnancy, was a positive sign, but it was not so simple. At night, my mind conjured the most terrible dreams. In one, the creature growing inside me wasn't a baby at all, but a shrunken little adult. Somehow, I knew that its face, wizened like an old skin fruit, was my mother's face. She had been waiting inside me all this time, and now she had stolen my baby's body, and I would give birth to her. In another, the baby was born perfect, smooth-skinned and lovely as a porcelain doll. I took my child everywhere. But then I looked in the pram, and in place of the beautiful child was a filthy, desecrated doll. My baby had never been real, had only ever been a figment of my desire. It was this doll I had carried around all this time, while the rest of us looked on in horror. I shared these dreams with Peter, her husband, and discussed with him the anxieties of which they were so clearly an indication. Do you think I'll be a good mother? I must have asked him this 1,000 times. Are you kidding? You'll be wonderful. You're patient, you're resilient, you're kind. He was right. I was these things. I didn't doubt it. Yet I suspected that being a good mother had little to do with possessing those traits good mothers ought to possess, that it hinged on something else entirely, required other obscure qualities that could neither be honed nor harnessed. How does a motherless mother? How does she know how, or does she simply not know? And if she doesn't, can she learn it on her own, or can she never learn it because she didn't have a mother to teach her? I reminded myself it wasn't true I was motherless. Many nights, as my child grew inside me, I lay awake, resisting sleep and the dreams sleep brought, and chased the tales of my earliest memories, trying to catch my mother in them. I remembered standing on the riverbank after we shot down the seabird and watching the father hold it under the water. I felt a weight in the memory, a pull, and I knew it was my mother standing beside me on the bank. But when I tried to turn away from the bird and look at her, see her, remember her, I lost the memory, as if it sensed what I was up to and expulsed me. I remembered the morning after she went, the sight of everyone massed in our yard. I turned away from them. I buried my face in my father's chest and wailed. I could remember the feeling of my grief in that moment, my need to be soothed by the one person who wasn't there, the dawning understanding that she never would be, not ever again. But when I tried to get the memory to give up more, to show me the mother I longed for in that moment, it denied me and denied me. I could see the burning, smell the heavy smoldering of wet wood, and see the smoke rise into the clouds until I couldn't tell where it ended and they began. But I couldn't see the images we burned of which the smoke was made. Still, I had to believe her mothering was in me, hidden away somewhere too deep for me to remember, but which might still serve me with my own child. Only here I ran up against an unanswerable question. My mother hadn't loved me as other mothers loved. Her vanishing was all the proof I needed of this. Impossible to say whether what traces of her I carried would guide me or lead me astray. When the time came, I paced our house through the night. I released blood and mucus and clots of glistening black jelly into the toilet, vomited a thin green slime with every contraction. Peter wiped my mouth with a damp cloth, pressed his hands into my back with all his strength. At dawn, we went to the clinic. In the birthing room, I labored in the bed we all labored in, and where all of us and all of our children were born. It went on for hours that were lifetimes and no time at all. Pain so unbearable, it seemed impossible that every mother I knew had borne it, that every person I knew had been born. Peter coached me as he had been taught by the fathers in town. He squeezed my hand and said, "You can do this," and "almost there," and "yes, good, push." Ordinary words, so insufficient to this task. The secret side of it he couldn't access, where it felt that my purpose was not to push this baby out, but to pull myself in, to squeeze myself inside myself and join my child there. And yet it was also Peter's ordinary and insufficient encouragements, his faith that they were enough, that kept me going. And as the day lightened, our child left me and entered the world, a small, squalling gray thing, hair and skin coated in creamy white curds. The very moment the nurse laid my baby on my chest, I felt the childless, alone Vera I had always feared I would be burn away like clouds at midday. The baby was a girl. We named her Iris. Our first afternoon home from the clinic, we were a bit at loose ends, uncertain what we were supposed to be doing. In the end, we did nothing. I lay on the sofa in the parlor, and Peter sat beside me with my feet in his lap. My feet had been cold the whole time we were at the clinic, and now at last they were warm. Iris slept on my stomach, which was still so round. Peter and I watched as she rose and fell with my breath, and we marveled at her improbable tininess, at her cheeks and forehead dusted with a pale shimmering fur, feet flaking gossamer skin, mouth suckling at the air even in sleep, pearly eyelids inlaid with whisper-thin red veins, the eyes beneath the shale color of the river at its depths. After a while, Peter dozed off, and I savored the feeling of lying awake in a room where the two dearest people to me in the world slept, utterly peaceful and vulnerable. When Iris woke, she nursed. Her soft, wet mouth suckled with more force than I could have imagined such a small thing capable of exerting. I looked at this tiny creature at my breast, wholly dependent on me, pure innocence. How could it be that she carried the potential to make me vanish, or to go herself one day? For the first time, I felt the full weight of our affliction, the peril of immense loss, and the power of immense love. the two forces impossible to disentangle, for they were one and the same. Very sloppily pulling up my phone, but I'm so happy to get to introduce Genevieve Plunkett. Genevieve is the author of Prepare Her, Stories, and a forthcoming novel, In the Lobby of the Dream House, which will be published by Catapult in 2023. Her fiction has appeared in the O. Henry Prize Stories, the Best Small Fictions, and journals such as New England Review, the Southern Review, and Electric Literature, among others. She lives in Vermont. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm thrilled to be here, and I'm completely starstruck to be reading among these authors. Let's see. I'm going to be reading the shortest short story from my collection, Prepare Her. It's called If Tooth Could Mean Heart. I will skip over some parts so that it's exactly 6 minutes long. But it's also a reminder, among other things, that pregnant, menstruating, uterus having people have been invalidated by the healthcare system for a long time. So if tooth could mean heart. When the pain in Helen's stomach began, her parents were concerned. They drove her to the emergency room where the doctors could find nothing wrong. Pain is common in pregnancy, they told her in apologetic, disparaging tones. But just to be safe, Helen was ordered an ultrasound. In a dark room, on a swimming, silvery screen, she was shown the parts of her baby, a thigh bone, a kidney, the fish mouth of the heart. The baby slipped in and out of the shadows, as if trying to keep its face above water, a drowning, living thing. Your baby is healthy, the obstetrician said, as if that solved it. So Helen went to her primary care doctor. She told him about the pain in her stomach, how it woke her at night, coming and going in strange, debilitating spells. It wasn't like a knife, as she had heard people describing excruciating pain, but rather a rebuke, a rogue part of her. The doctor took this news unceremoniously. Some women experience pain differently than others, he told her. He put his glasses back on and studied her form. By then, she was large, carrying the child far out in front like a lengthwise watermelon. She often felt embarrassed by this, as if her stomach were somehow indecent, with its brown stripe, the creeping hairs, as if she could not just be modestly pregnant like every other woman. She hated how the lower part of her stomach plunged through the elastic band on her pants, drooping like a cabbage hanging out of a grocery bag. And now, with this pain itself, she was beginning to understand, was not good enough. You could not call a doctor's office and say, I have pain. You had to be specific. It seemed that doctors were waiting for something very specific, the red flag that only they had the training to recognize. Helen knew of a famous playwright who had died of a heart attack. His only symptom had been a severe toothache. He had been following his wife to the car on his way to the dentist when he fell down dead. It seemed to Helen that if tooth could mean heart, then perhaps she needed to change her strategy. My ears are killing me, she told the doctor. This was not working. She had developed a somewhat embarrassing way to cope with the spells. It worked in the middle of the night when she was alone, soaked in sweat. There now, she'd say, it's not so bad. You'll be better in no time. It was a part of herself that she did not recognize, this cooing voice, this pitiful little person, like a very old woman trying to comfort a dead cat. You're a good girl, she'd say. Hush now. She remembered, as a child, the first time she became conscious of her heartbeat, a vexed hammering in her neck. She had shut herself into the bathroom, sat on the closed toilet lid, and pressed her finger to it, as if staving off a flood. Up until that day, she had believed in her own anatomy in the same way she believed in the continents on the map, the same way she had pretended to understand the constellations in the sky with an abstract obedience. The discovery of her heart, or rather the acknowledgement of it, was an uncomfortable surprise. It meant that she was full of pieces, just like everyone else. Helen had gotten herself in to see a specialist. She was led to an examining room and told to change into a very short paper gown, which, with the addition of her large belly, fit more like an oversized t-shirt. She sat for a long time, eyeing various long, invasive-looking instruments set up along the counter, feeling cold, apprehensive. The doctor came in. He was a white-haired man who sat on a low stool so that he was eye level to a part of the gown that fit the most awkwardly. He had a list of questions, he said, and he began to read without looking up. Vomiting, he said, as if it were a very formal statement, like the beginning of a sermon. Nausea. To which Helen answered, no, not since the first trimester. At this, the doctor glanced up and seemed to notice her situation for the first time, his eyebrows raised, like a doctor who is interested in looking at an especially good wound. He wanted to know if sexual intercourse had become painful. I'm single, Helen said. She felt like a troublesome student, compelled to give a disruptive, although correct answer. She thought about her ex-boyfriend, Julian, about his wide, dewy eyes. The doctor wanted to know if Helen had any history of mental illness. Helen studied his face as he looked at her over his glasses. A sharp, elderly look, like a professor about to speak his mind candidly before a classroom. But the doctor did not speak. The day before, Eliza, her friend, had invited her over, made her herbal tea that smelled like lawn clippings, and then offered to be her birth partner. It's not just hand-holding, she said. You need someone who's going to be straight with you. Eliza had just finished telling her the story of a woman who'd given birth in the elevator of the hospital. Helen had heard many of these stories from Eliza, a woman who had given birth in her pant leg, who had to have the material cut carefully away so that the baby, a sticky, pearish lump, could be extracted safely, or the 50-year-old woman who thought that her growing belly was cancer. Eliza had become obsessed with these stories, with these dopey women who could not figure out childbirth. It's going to hurt like hell, she said. Helen left her appointment with a specialist feeling dull and misunderstood. In the end, there had been no need for the paper gown. No tests were performed. The doctor had set his clipboard down and given her a number to call. A therapist, he told her. And for the first time, he had looked at her kindly, lifted his hand as if to touch her belly, then pulled it back. He shook her hand. Outside, the air was cool, windy, smelling like melting snow and exhaust from the parking lot. Helen could hear the humming of the hospital, the distant whoosh of the highway. She walked toward the bus stop, pulling her sweater around her belly. The baby was moving with an abrupt liquid pressure, both aggravated and sweet. She thought about how Julian had put his hands on her stomach, poked at her jeans between her legs in a childish display of curiosity and love. Julian was flawed, but he was also tiresomely earnest. If he were here, Helen thought, he would try his best to understand. He would do everything to understand. She found Julian at his apartment, blinking in his doorway, as though he had just woken up. He seemed very mysterious, standing there without his shirt, not quite a stranger, but a newer version of himself, a gaunt maturity having overtaken him, it seemed, since she had last seen him. He invited her in with awkward formality and offered her a chair at the small kitchen table. She was about to speak, a rehearsed little speech about why she had left him and why she had come back, when the pain returned, that terrible, defiant throbbing in her gut. She slumped forward in her chair and felt Julian's arms around her, trying to hold her up. Hey, he was saying, hey now, like a quiet, grateful, bewildered admonition. As he held her, looked at her with his terrified eyes, Helen thought about the famous playwright and his toothache, how his wife had reported hearing a loud thud as she walked to the car. Thank you. Really excited now to introduce Nandi Rose. So originally from Williamstown, Nandi Rose is a musician who has built a career over the last decade under the name Halfway, touring internationally and releasing multiple critically acclaimed albums with renowned indie label Anti Records, known for Mavis Staples, Tom Waits, and Fleet Foxes. She is now based in the Hudson Valley, where she is working on her first book, a memoir.
Hello. Hi, Dad.
What a joy it is to be here. Thank you so much, Anna, for organizing. I'm honored to be amidst this incredible company. As you just heard, I am not a published author, unlike these amazing folks. I am a musician by trade, but I am making a foray into memoir writing, and I've had a lot of encouragement from Anna. So I'm going to read a chapter from this memoir in progress. It's a collection of lyric essays, and this one is called The Hummingbird. Along with everybody else, we hit the road on the 4th of July weekend. On the highway, chunks of fiberglass, bubblegum pink and ominous, flap in the wake of trucks. The vehicles drive on, powering through the pink storm. I realize, watching the tufts bounce off the windshield, that I've come to think of my womb this way. Shards of discarded poison that no one wants to look directly at. I've read that environmental pollutants can cause miscarriages, can cause all sorts of gynecological problems. Our bodies are great big storage tanks for toxins that travel unseen around us. I wonder if this is part of what's happening to me, why the heart stopped beating, why there is still, all these months later, this rotten inflammation, the continued moan of a subcutaneous pain, why nothing will take root again. I think of the river on our street with its heaps of trash in the muck. Where we live, people know not to swim in the rivers after a rain. You have to wait until the runoff settles down. But where else does that slurry of chemicals go? I have no way of knowing the exact effects of the external environment on my internal ecosystem, but I can see it. The suspended embryo soaking up the chloromethane in our drinking water, filling like a plastic bag. The fiberglass floats on the road like the dust in the Upside Down, the negative imprint of the world in the show Stranger Things. Meanwhile, my mind is imprinted with a single pink line, another negative pregnancy test this morning. I cry quietly in the passenger seat, my face turned toward the window, while you listen to a Mets game. Our marriage works for so many reasons, but giving each other the space to process in our ways, even in the small container of our car on a 9-hour drive, is a big one. Kendrick Lamar singing "I Grieve Different" on the track United by Grief. With every mile, I try to shed the scales of my sadness so that when we reach the cabin in Forest City, I will be my soft pink self again. We make this pilgrimage north every year, stopping at the Shaw's in Bangor for groceries before proceeding another 2 hours. We cut through Topsfield and Lincoln and Lee, tiny Maine towns that get tinier as you go north. They look unremarkable now, but come winter, they will be fortified outposts against the long and bitter cold. We turn right at the former general store in Brookton and continue down a winding road lined in green. My parents saw a moose on this road once, so we look every year for the great blur of a body rising from the trees. It doesn't come, but finally the lake does. Its reedy, marshy end, and we know we're close. We pass Grey Ghost Road, and just before we hit the Canadian border, we find what we're looking for. A mailbox tied with red line, fixed on a rock on the roadside. An unmistakable cairn sign. At last, the long journey ends. The cabin rises before us, a familiar sight of tawny wood, miraculously unchanged by age. A carved sign outside welcomes us to Hummer Hughesley, Hummingbird House. The screen door with its tight hinges screeches open, and we step into a home that time has frozen. The same red and brown gingham blankets, the rocking chairs in front of the wood stove, a bookshelf stuffed with Judy Blume and the Babysitters Club. In the doorway to the kitchen, a peeling collage I made when I was 9 still hangs, the squares of magazine paper curling. And that smell, must and lake and camphor, mousy in the corners, met with the algal whiff of wet bathing suits drying on the porch. Memory is a kind of wilderness, and here I get lost in it. My grandmother Dee Dee loved hummingbirds. They're printed on pillowcases and wall hangings around the cabin, and a large globe of nectar brings real ones to a feeder near the porch. Sometimes we catch the splash of red on their throats, crimson and shimmering as the lipstick Dee Dee wore every day. I like to think we're visited by the same individual birds each year, that they make the trek the way that we do. Hummingbirds are territorial, after all, and tend to stay in one area between migrations. But this, I learn, also makes them more susceptible to the local air pollution wherever they land. Their small lungs suck up the same square footage and all the toxins hidden within. Dee Dee and my grandfather Jack came here to Forest City in the 60s in search of the perfect summer retreat. The two criteria, extremely remote and good for bass fishing. They convinced some of Jack's Yale colleagues to get places up here too, and a little New Haven commune was born in the far northern woods. It was an idyllic time. For many summers, their nets filled with fish. But one day, my grandparents returned from a long trip to town to find the cabin burning to the ground. The air was a roar. Red flames encircled the paper birches as the air filled with a burnt Christmas tree smell. Neighbors and local forest rangers joined forces to put it out, pumping water from the lake to kill the flames. One of their neighbors, George, later wrote a whole account of the event, which I find sheathed in plastic in a drawer. In it, George recalls that Dee Dee walked around the ruins with red eyes watering above a red-painted frown, her hands on her forehead in a characteristic gesture before rallying into action. Jack lives with his memories, Dee Dee said, but not me. You can't live in the past. You have to rebuild your life and look to the future. There's a word for when living tissue engulfs foreign objects, becoming stronger for it. Edaphoecotropism. Like a tree with a length of wire beneath its skin or roots growing around a discarded tire. This place reminds me of a grave, Jack said, walking shell-shocked amidst the burned ruins of his beloved home while his wife and neighbors doused the flames. But the next summer they rebuilt on the ashes, and a new home grew around the wounds. A second life birthed from the first scar. The cabin we inhabit now sits with shards of crockery in its bones. I take the steps down to the water, and East Grand Lake spills before me, swallowing the horizon. There's a line like a mouth where the lake and the woods meet, blue and then black and then green, a skyline of pines reflecting down into dark water. I have grown up on this dock. As a lonely child, the youngest of a big clan of cousins, I'd sit here and make paper boats. The ducks that visited were my friends, even if only for the promise of bread. I didn't like playing the games my cousins played, games like Stock and War played late in the night in the woods. But mostly they just ignored me anyway. So I kept to myself, starting a long tradition of sitting alone on the dock. Last year I sat here and imagined it was the last time we'd come alone without our child. Now I hear cries of Mama and Papa from across the lake where my cousins play in big families smelling like sunscreen and wild strawberries. Still, I cannot join their games. It's an old wound following me, grief trailing like blood in the water. A heron appears like a storm cloud, unfolds the atlas of its wings and skims low. It lands on the top of a tall pine, its body dissolving to become another branch. In the arms of the lake, I dissolve too. My grandparents may have bought this place because of the good fishing in these waters, but I am reversing that legacy, dismantling it. I am not here to take, only to be taken away, to be subsumed. I shake my head at the flattened turquoise metal of a soda can jammed into the cattails, the party boat leaking gas, the jet skis that silence the loons as they call for their mates. The song of this place echoes above the engines. It asks to be cherished. All I have to do is look and listen, loosing the arrow of myself deep into that wilderness, aiming for the other side. When I return from the water, I find you playing guitar on the screened-in porch. This is your own dock for turning over thoughts. You play nameless tunes, searching for melodies that mean something. We share a cup of coffee and watch the wind change directions. Suddenly, there's a buzz and sizzle as a hummingbird flies into the screen. Its thin beak lodges into the mesh, a living sword disarmed. Terrible squeaks and shudders come from its body as we watch in horror, paralyzed. Time stills in the blur of wing beats. After a few moments, I raise my hand, palm out flat, to try to push the beak out. But before I can, the bird tears itself free and is off like lightning. This place is like that, I think, caught, yet frantic to unleash its motion. All the memories pull me back to who I was, to who we were as a family, and yet I yearn to make something new of it, of myself, to undo the harm, to clear the smoke, to be the gentle palm outstretched. Thank you. Thank you so much. Our next reader is Yanyi. Yanyi is the author of Dream of the Divided Field and The Year of Blue Water, and winner of the 2018 Yale Series of Younger Poets Prize. Most recently, he is the recipient of a 2023 Vermont Arts Council grant and a 2022 Tan Foundation Award. He teaches poetry at large.
Hello. Nice. I'm the shortest one, so usually I have to bring it down a couple of notches. So thank you so much to Anna for organizing this, and to Richard, wherever you are, for hosting us here at Williams Bookstore. I have really enjoyed listening to all of my readers. I'm going to do a little bit of a mixtape. I was allowed to read other people's writings, so I brought 4 books. 2 of them are mine, but don't worry, I'm only reading 7 in total, so you can count them not on one hand, but only 1.5. So just a slight content warning. My interest as, I think, a person at this moment is around the idea of abuse and power in relationships. In thinking about bodily autonomy, I've been thinking also a lot about what does that mean in society and in relation to our loved ones who sometimes end up hurting us. So just content warning for everyone out there, and I have a set list, so I know where I'm going. So this is from What the Living Do by Marie Howe. It's called The Mother. In her early old age, the mother's toenails curl over her toes so that when she walks across the kitchen floor, some click. The doctor has warned her for the 3rd time that her legs will ulcerate if she doesn't rub moisturizer into them, so unwilling is she to touch her own body or care for it. The same woman who stood many nights at the foot of that attic stairs as her husband weaved and stammered up into the room where her daughter slept. On the landing, in her bathrobe, by the laundry chute, unmoving, like a statue in the children's game her children play. And now the soft drone of her daughter's waking voice, reasoning and rising, and the first slap, and the scrape of her son's chair pushed back from his desk, the air thick now with their separate listening, and again the girl's voice, now quietly weeping, and the creak of her bed. In the game, someone has to touch you free, then you're human again. You can see the books. I'm not going to announce them every time. So this is from me. This poem is called Tenants. My mother wants me to know that she drank a bottle of water in the hotel room and that I might be charged for it. Drinking a bottle of water in a hotel room. A hotel being where we buy the right to stay still when no place will stay for us. On my way to the airport to pick up my mother, I carry a meal that may be light enough for after a flight. When the body is put into motion, it is not still. My mother's body has been in motion for 14 hours, and what can we eat after that? My mother's body never stops. My mother's body doesn't own anything, not even the motion it is put into. I feel like the Home Shopping Network, like, next. The poems in this book are not titled, mostly, so I'm just going to read them. Here's what it's like if it's hard to put yourself first. You genuinely feel happiness when someone else's needs are fulfilled. At least, this is what you know as happiness. The relief of not being seen, of having someone preoccupied with themselves. Well, that's not exactly right. There is relief in seeing another person being happy. Being happy makes it possible for that other person to love someone. In my case, I want another person to be able to love me. Taking care. I take off my binder before a massage and dream of top surgery, not having to wait for the masseur to ask about my abnormal desire to be inside this body once, easily identified and therefore easy to take care of. I should just take care of myself. Ask a doctor to remove the parts that are reprehensible, like when they break the nose in order to construct a better one. I bring a picture to the hairdresser. I bring a picture to the mirror where I cut my skin with my eyes. As a man, I've learned something of nationhood. The shape of a brook now straddled by a dam or choked by it. This is Chosen by the Lion by Linda Gregg. I am the one chosen by the lion at sundown and dragged back from the shining water. Yanked back to bushes and torn open, blood blazing at the throat and breast of me. Taken as meat, devoured as spirit by spirit. The others will return quickly to drink again and peacefully. But for me now, there's only faith. Only the fact that the tall windows I lived with were left uncovered halfway up. And the silence of those days I lived there which were marked by your arrivals like stations on a long journey. You write to say you love me and lie awake in stillness to avoid the pain. I remember looking at you from within at the last moment, with faith like a gift handkerchief, delicate and almost fragile. This is the final thing. Purity and faith, power and blood. Is there nothing to see? Not memory even of forgetting? Only the body eating the body? What of faith when it meets death, being when it is hard to account for? The nipples you bit and the body you possessed lie buried within you. My faith shines as the moon in the darkness on water, as the sky in the day. Does it hover in the air around you? Does it come like a flower in your groin? Or is it like before, when you were alone and about to fall asleep, saying out loud in the darkness, Linda, and hearing me answer immediately, yes. I know, it was a good one. It's a very good one. That poem isn't as... She wrote this book after a really abusive relationship. It's an incredible book. Okay, two more. One from each of my books. Reconstruction. Do not grow flowers in the valley of my breasts. Slip the muck until it learns to lick and multiply. Chew each root to the last sinew still mangled and attached to me. In a spew of yellow pus, I'm crowned with my wound. No, I am not so generous. What I've tried to touch, I had no capacity. All my life, I believed I was the cruel one. I couldn't say what I believed. I lived it. You tell me that the old you is dead. I am also not who I used to be. The revolution is emotional. I found a reason to not fear death. I found more reasons to live, reasons to change what is living inside me and around me. The revolution is that I care about my own safety, that I believe my life is valuable and worth pursuing. As in, I'm worth the work of transformations. As in, I do not fear how I will emerge for myself or how many times. Thank you. And thank you to everyone for being here.
Wow, thank you all so much. We have books for sale if anybody's interested, and I'm betting that the authors are probably willing to sign too. So thanks again, and we appreciate you coming.